History remembers the samurai as noble figures of pure honor, men who lived by an unyielding moral code and chose death before dishonor. Yet if you traveled back to the misty forests of 8th century Japan, you would not find refined philosophers in pristine silk armor. You would find desperate, sun-baked frontiersmen fighting for their lives in the mud against an enemy the emperor could not defeat. The imperial court in Kyoto was a world of poetry, incense, and delicate politics, completely detached from the harsh reality of the northern wilderness. To expand his empire, the emperor sent conscripted peasant armies into the dense northern forests to subdue the Emishi, a native people who fought on horseback with terrifying agility. The imperial soldiers, weighted down by heavy leather plates and moving in rigid formations, were slaughtered in silent ambush after silent ambush. Realizing his regular army was useless, the emperor made a decision that would quietly alter the course of Japanese history for the next 1,000 years. He abandoned national conscription and hired wealthy landowners on the wild frontiers, men who had learned to ride and shoot like the mountain tribes they fought. These early fighters were known as the saburao, a word that simply meant those who serve. They were not national heroes, nor were they motivated by abstract loyalty to a distant court they had never seen. They fought for land, tax exemptions, and the sheer survival of their families. They spent decades mastering mounted archery, leaning low over their wooden saddles to release heavy arrows at full gallop. As these provincial families grew wealthier and more skilled at violence, the delicate aristocrats in Kyoto grew increasingly dependent on them to settle personal grudges and collect taxes from rebellious provinces. The court retained the titles, the sacred rituals, and the high prestige, but the frontier clans held something far more dangerous, a complete monopoly on physical force. It took 3 centuries for these rugged warriors to realize that the refined lords in Kyoto had no real power to enforce their own laws. The men who had been hired to serve slowly realized that they no longer needed to obey. By the 12th century, the illusion of imperial authority vanished beneath the weight of 2 massive warrior coalitions, the Taira and the Minamoto. What began as local land disputes erupted into the Genpei War, a brutal struggle that engulfed the entire island nation. This was not a war of chivalrous duels and elegant manners, but a desperate campaign of total destruction. In 1185, at the naval battle of Dan no Ura, the Taira clan found themselves trapped on warships, surrounded by their enemies, the sea turning red with blood. Seeing that defeat was absolute, the grandmother of the 6-year-old Emperor Antoku wrapped the child in her arms, grabbed the sacred imperial sword, and stepped off the wooden deck into the ocean. The boy drowned in the dark water, and with him drowned the ancient era of absolute imperial rule. The victor of that bloody war, Minamoto no Yoritomo, did not claim the throne for himself. He understood that the people still viewed the emperor as a living god, a divine figure needed to maintain spiritual harmony. Instead, Yoritomo demanded a title that gave him complete control over the military, Sei Tai Shogun, the supreme military commander. He set up his capital in the coastal town of Kamakura, far away from the political corruption and decadent influences of Kyoto. This was the birth of the Kamakura Shogunate, the first military government in Japanese history. To secure his new dictatorship, Yoritomo allowed no rivals to exist,
hunting down and executing his own younger brother, the brilliant general who had won the war for him. The samurai were now the supreme rulers of Japan, but the foundation of their new empire was built on deep paranoia and fratricide.
For nearly a century, the samurai ruled their private domains, collecting taxes and refining their martial skills in relative peace. Then, in the summer of 1274, strange sails appeared off the southern coast of Kyushu. Kublai Khan, the ruler of the massive Mongol Empire, had conquered China and Korea and now demanded total submission from the island nation. When the samurai refused his demands, the Khan sent a massive invasion fleet carrying thousands of battle-hardened soldiers. The samurai rode down to the beaches, expecting traditional single combat, shouting their proud lineages and challenging worthy opponents to honorable duels. The Mongols did not care about individual honor. They fought as a unified war machine, moving in tight shield formations, firing poison arrows and launching iron gunpowder bombs that exploded with deafening thunder. The samurai were completely overwhelmed by this unfamiliar way of war, saved only when a sudden violent storm battered the coast and forced the surviving Mongol ships to retreat into the open sea. Knowing the invaders would return, the samurai spent 7 exhausting years constructing a massive stone wall along the coast of Hakata Bay, training relentlessly for a collective fight. When the second Mongol fleet arrived in 1281, the largest amphibious invasion force the world would see until the modern era, the samurai held the stone wall for weeks in desperate, bloody hand-to-hand combat. Just as the Japanese defenses reached their breaking point, the sky turned black and a colossal hurricane swept across the ocean. Thousands of Mongol ships were smashed against the coastal rocks, drowning over 100,000 invading soldiers in the churning foam. The Japanese called this miraculous hurricane the kamikaze, or the divine wind, believing their gods had personally intervened to save the sacred land. Yet this great victory carried a silent poison that would destroy the military government from within. In traditional samurai warfare, a victorious shogun rewarded his loyal warriors with the land seized from the defeated enemy. But the Mongols were foreign invaders who brought no territory to conquer, leaving the shogun with thousands of bankrupt, battle-worn warriors demanding rewards that did not exist. The shogun had spent vast fortunes building coastal defenses and maintaining armies, leaving his treasury entirely empty. Resentment festered in every province, faith in the government collapsed, and within decades, local lords stopped answering the shogun's call, plunging the country into 2 centuries of relentless civil war. This dark era became known as the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the warring states, a time when central authority ceased to exist entirely. Japan fractured into dozens of independent territories ruled by powerful warlords called daimyo. Society was gripped by a terrifying concept known as Gekogochu, meaning the lower rules the higher. Generals assassinated their masters in the sleep, brothers poisoned brothers for inheritance, and sons marched armies against their own fathers. The idea that a samurai possessed an innate, unbroken loyalty to his lord during this period is a myth created long after the fires had cooled. Loyalty was a fluid transaction that lasted only as long as a lord could pay his men in gold, grain, and land.
Warfare transformed completely
during this century of constant bloodshed. The romantic image of two mounted archers meeting on an open field was replaced by massive peasant armies marching under bright banner crests. Tens of thousands of common farmers were drafted into service as ashigaru, foot soldiers armed with long bamboo spears, forming impenetrable walls of iron and wood. The battlefield was no longer a place for individual glory, but an industrial furnace that consumed thousands of lives in a single afternoon. Out of this chaotic meat grinder rose three extraordinary men, each possessing a drastically different personality, who would attempt to unify the shattered nation through sheer force of will. The first was Oda Nobunaga, a ruthless visionary who viewed tradition not as a guide but as an obstacle to be crushed. In 1575, at the Battle of Nagashino, Nobunaga faced the feared Takeda cavalry, considered the most elite and unstoppable horsemen in all of Japan. Instead of meeting them in a traditional charge, Nobunaga lined up 3,000 peasants armed with matchlock muskets, weapons introduced by Portuguese traders just 30 years prior. He arranged his gunners behind wooden palisades and ordered them to fire in continuous, rotating volleys. As wave after wave of armored samurai rode into the muddy field, they were torn apart by a wall of lead and smoke, destroying the most legendary cavalry force in a matter of hours. Nobunaga proved that a peasant with 2 weeks of gun training could kill a master samurai who had practiced swordsmanship for 30 years. He burned down ancient mountain monasteries that opposed his rule, slaughtering thousands of monks, women, and children to prove that even sacred institutions were subject to his authority. Yet his brutal efficiency created deep hatred among his own ranks. In 1582, as Nobunaga rested inside a Kyoto temple with only a small bodyguard, his own trusted general, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned his army around and surrounded the building. Realizing there was no escape from the flames engulfing the temple, Nobunaga sliced open his own abdomen, leaving his vision of a unified Japan unfinished. The man who stepped into the vacuum of power was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, whose rise to dominance was unprecedented in Japanese history. Hideyoshi was not born into a proud samurai lineage. He was the son of a poor, nameless peasant who had joined Nobunaga as a humble sandal-bearer. Through sheer intelligence, strategic brilliance, and an uncanny ability to read human weakness, he rose to become the most powerful man in the country. Once he secured control over the warring provinces, Hideyoshi took a step that permanently altered the social structure of Japan. He launched the Great Sword Hunt of 1588, sending soldiers into every village to confiscate all weapons from the peasantry, melting down the metal to build a massive statue of the Buddha.
Hideyoshi strictly outlawed social mobility, decreeing that a farmer could only be a farmer, a merchant could only be a merchant, and a samurai was now a distinct hereditary military class. The man who had risen from absolute poverty to rule the country pulled the ladder up behind him, making sure no other peasant could ever repeat his impossible journey. He forced all samurai to leave their farms and move into castle towns, separating the sword from the land for the first time. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, he left behind an infant son and a fragile council of 5 regents sworn to protect the child until he came of age. But among those 5 regents sat a man who had waited decades for this exact moment. Tokugawa Ieyasu was a master of patience, a statesman who understood that power came to those who outlasted their enemies. On a cold, foggy morning in October 1600, the political tensions following Hideyoshi's death erupted at the Battle of Sekigahara. Over 160,000 warriors gathered in a narrow mountain valley, their banners hidden beneath a thick curtain of fog. The clash was the largest and deadliest samurai battle ever fought, yet its outcome was not decided by tactical genius or heroic charges. It was decided by months of secret letters and bribes. At the crucial moment of the battle, a key general who had pledged his army to the opposing side turned his cannons around and fired into his own allies, shattering their lines and securing total victory for Ieyasu. 3 years later, the emperor granted Ieyasu the title of shogun, marking the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate, an era of absolute peace that would last for more than 2 centuries. To prevent the constant civil wars that had torn the country apart for generations, Ieyasu instituted a system of terrifying control. He forced every daimyo to spend every other year living in the capital city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, under the watchful eye of the shogun's spies. When a lord returned to his home province, he was forced to leave his wife and heir behind in Edo as political hostages. The massive financial cost of maintaining 2 grand residences and marching hundreds of miles back and forth completely drained the wealth of regional lords, making it impossible for them to finance a rebellion. This enforced peace brought an existential crisis to the warrior class. For centuries, a samurai's identity had been defined entirely by his ability to fight and kill on the battlefield. Now, with no wars to fight, castles were turned into administrative offices, and martial skills gave way to paperwork and taxation. The samurai were transformed from brutal battlefield champions into desk-bound bureaucrats, accountants, and civil servants. They were legally required to carry their 2 swords wherever they went, yet those blades rarely left their wooden sheaths except for formal ceremonies or maintenance.
Training for a samurai began in early childhood, where boys were conditioned to endure extreme hardship without complaint. They were taught to walk barefoot through winter snow, fast for days, and view physical violence as only a temporary distraction. Yet physical violence was only one half of a complete samurai education. Under the concept of Bunbu Ryodo, the dual path of the pen and the sword, a true warrior was expected to be as skilled in poetry, calligraphy, and the Zen tea ceremony as he was in archery and swordsmanship. To cultivate only the sword made a man a dangerous brute. To cultivate only the pen made him weak and incapable of protecting his home. Women of the samurai class played a vital role in maintaining the strength and honor of the clan. Known as onamusha, these women were trained in the use of the naginata, a long polearm with a curved blade specifically designed to neutralize the height and strength advantages of male attackers. When male warriors marched off to distant battlefields, samurai women were left in complete control of the estate, responsible for defending the castle, managing finances, and educating the children. They carried a small dagger called a kaiken inside their kimono sleeves, prepared to defend their personal dignity or take their own lives if their home fell to an invading force. For 250 years, this isolated world remained suspended in time, oblivious to the rapid industrial revolution taking place across the ocean.
Then, on a scorching summer day in July 1853, 4 massive black steamships, belching dark smoke, entered Edo Bay without permission. Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy arrived with a fleet of modern naval warships bearing heavy naval cannons and an ultimatum from the American president. Japan was ordered to end its 2-century policy of national isolation and open its ports to foreign trade or face immediate military destruction. The shogunate's advisors looked out at the massive iron vessels and realized with sickening clarity that their ancient defenses were utterly useless. The samurai lining the shores in lacquered armor, armed with antique matchlock muskets and swords, could do nothing against long-range naval artillery that could level the capital from miles away. The shogunate yielded to the Western demands, signing unequal treaties that granted foreign powers immense trading privileges and legal immunity on Japanese soil. This humiliation shattered the perceived legitimacy of the military government, sparking a wave of furious anger that split the nation into 2 violent factions.